Morning. Good morning, everybody in person and our virtual participants. We have a drizzly morning here in Providence, so thank you all for making it out. I want to extend a warm welcome to the second and final day of Voices of Mass Incarceration, a symposium. Yesterday anchored us with music and poetry. We dove into the historical context for Mumia Abu-Jamal's case. We learned how artists are creating space to reimagine healing in the public realm. We also had the opportunity to open the Mumia Abu-Jamal exhibition at the John Hay Library, and we had a wonderful crowd. Today, we have 3 panels. The first panel will discuss the policing impact on the carceral state, the second taking up the crisis of medical care in the carceral state, and the third focusing on gender, justice, and healing. As with yesterday, I invite you to be present, to be reflective, to be open. You'll have a chance to interact with the panelists during question and answers and also during breaks. And I hope that there is an intimate crowd, so there is plenty of time for conversation and reflection. Without further ado, we're going to turn it over to our first panel, the policing impact on the carceral system. I'm so pleased and honored that this panel is moderated by Rodney Chatman, Vice President for Public Safety and Emergency Management at Brown University and the Chief of Police here at Brown University. Chief Chatman is an absolutely incredible individual and has been so deeply engaged with us on this topic, and I'm really humbled and honored that you're moderating this panel. Our esteemed panelists are Robert A. Brown, Chair and Professor, Department of Criminal Justice, and the Chair of the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Martha Hurley, who's the Dean of Liberal Arts, Communication, and Social Sciences at Sinclair College in Dayton, Ohio. And Kim Neal, who's an independent policing auditor and director of the Office of Independent Policing Auditor, City of Alexandria, Virginia. And their full biographies are available online. Thank
you. Before we start, I really want to be intentional when I say thank you, Amanda, and thank you to everyone who put this symposium together. I say that very humbly because I come into this time, place, and space with multiple identities that I think are important and relevant to the subject at hand. I am a Black son of Howard and Ernestine Chatman. I am a Black father to Rodney and Ryan. I am a Black husband to Angela Chatman, and I'm a Black brother to Daryl, Greg, and Reginald. But in the past 33 years, I've also been a Black police officer. And so bringing all these intersectional identities to this conversation in a forum like this really means so much to me because it helps me unpack a lot for myself in understanding my life's work and my position in it. And I'm very proud of the panel that we have here. That's a little bit of my journey to my approach to today. But I wanted to ask, since we have very diverse experience in terms of research and experience and perspective of our panelists, if we can just go down the line and just tell us a little bit about your journey to this time, place, and space. Sure. And we'll start, Robert.
Oh, he started alphabetically right next to me. Thank you, and like you, I find myself holding multiple statuses. I view myself as a Black American male, son of Jeanette, and son of Robert Lee. In referencing my father, I want to share that I'm the child of a formerly incarcerated person. He died in a federal prison, MCI Butner, back in 2019, and his life and my life have very much been intertwined in a way that it brings me here. I started going into prisons as a boy at the age of 5, 6 years old, visiting him. He was what they used to call a habitual offender or a career offender, and shortly after I graduated from college, he received his life sentence. And we're from Washington, D.C., statehood for D.C., and because he committed his crimes in Washington, D.C., he was a federal prisoner, and he was moved around a lot. So as we talk about the impact of the impact of imprisonment. And something that's come out through the last 2 days, I don't think of things from a mass incarceration perspective, but it's in part because for most of my life, I have been connected to our criminal justice system and penal system. Fast forward, I ended up choosing a path of criminal justice academically and professionally, and I have experienced criminal justice from both the person visiting, the family member, the professional working on legal teams, and part of my life background, I used to work for the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, a nonprofit organization where I used to do parole plans for prisoners, death penalty mitigation, and it was when I decided to try to become Dr. Brown that I switched my trajectory and became a policing scholar. So I've lived a life where I've been focused on corrections and correctional issues and how they impact communities to, I do things with cops now, or for the last 20 years. I do research, training, and evaluation, but I've navigated all of that as the son of Robert Lee.
Awesome. Thank you. Martha.
If you looked at my bio, you'll notice that much of my work has been with the incarcerated or the formerly incarcerated, rather than policing. I come to you today as a scholar who found myself involved in a hotbed around policing issues. I had a friend who worked for Advocates for Basic Legal Equity in Dayton, Ohio, who asked me if I would look at some data, because I'm a data-driven person. And when I looked at that data, I said, "Are you kidding me?" The stops of African Americans in that community were quite significant. And my ask of the local government was, just take a look at this data and have some conversations about what is happening in your community. And it stirred up a lot of things. I found myself receiving calls and emails, and there was significant pushback at a former institution. And from that small request, "Martha, what do you think about this data?" I now, several years later, have found myself involved in a number of policing projects. And I've also, as an African-American mother, found myself having to tell my son, do not drive through certain areas near the institution that he was enrolled in. All that as a result of an ask to look at data and comment. And so I'm here today as someone with a long period of scholarship on correctional issues, who now, at this point in my career, finds myself deeply involved in work with local police departments and community.
Thank you.
My name is Kim Neal. My primary business is civilian oversight of law enforcement. And one of the panelists yesterday morning referenced the Philadelphia Civilian Review Board. So that's what I do. My business is to basically serve as a voice for community members when it comes to interactions with law enforcement, to try to enhance those communications, to try to enhance those relationships. And I've worked in different cities doing that. Alexandria is my latest city, but I've also worked in Fort Worth, Texas, as well as Cincinnati, Ohio. All three very different cities, all three different sizes, and all three with different issues as it relates to policing. And one of the things that a lot of people are learning more about, particularly since the unfortunate death of George Floyd, is about civilian oversight of law enforcement and what it means to the community, what it means to the police, and what it means to those that are incarcerated. Because there is an aspect of civilian oversight of policing that involves our correctional institutions. And we also want to hold the officers in those institutions accountable and make sure that those institutions are transparent. And so that is what I do primarily in my day-to-day life.
So I want to talk a little bit about that accountability piece, because Martha shared some observation and data that supported her observation and her theory. And I would say, on a personal note, I was stopped in that same community. And as a police officer myself, I had a pass. They recognized me as an officer, and I could flash a badge. But there aren't that many badges out there. And I want to talk about the accountability piece, as well as the piece of the impact and disparate outcomes for people who don't have the privilege of having a badge or having other privileges. If you can speak to that, any of you.
Well, from my aspect, I do study the data, and I look at patterns in policing and law enforcement. And I recognize those patterns, and based on those patterns, I talk to law enforcement, I talk to city leaders, I talk to the community, I share my results, because I believe that just as like I'm holding the law enforcement transparent and being accountable, I also want to hold my office accountable as well. And through that data that we collect, whether it's through surveys, whether it's through focus groups, we take that data and we look at whether there's patterns in the police department as it relates to use of force, as it relates to stops, as it relates to potential racial profiling. And we take that data and we also think about how we can address if that data is not necessarily the best data when it comes to what that department is doing. We look at solutions as to how we can build on those relationships. But the most important part from a law enforcement standpoint, and it's really, sometimes it's hard for law enforcement to think about it from this global perspective, is to bring the community voice. And the one part of my job that I feel very strongly about is that we also always have to bring our community members in on what the solutions are as we relate to the interactions with law enforcement. And so that data definitely depicts what that interaction should look like. And it also allows community members to understand what exactly the data depicts from the law enforcement standpoint too. So I've been involved in programs, and I've called it different things, where I actually bring community members and law enforcement in a room, and we talk about problem-solving measures as it relates to those communities in which they live and work. And that problem-solving generally occurs in those communities that are most impacted by policing, and it's been pretty successful to date.
Awesome. So when you're talking about and made reference to perhaps a paradigm shift in getting police officers to understand that when community members who've been impacted by poor policing, and historically policing that has disenfranchised and denied rights, why community members see a uniformed officer and don't have a sense of, a sense of well-being with it. It brought up, and I don't want to take anything from you, Martha or Rob, about this, but I think it might be, I'm going to try to get a video shown if I can, because this video is likely to elicit a lot of emotion, because there's an attempt well, I'll let you guys give your perspectives on it, but this video is likely to have strong emotions from community members and strong emotion from police officers. And I happened to be present when this speech was given, so let's give this a shot.
Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to take a moment to address a significant and fundamental issue confronting our profession, particularly within the United States. Clearly, this is a challenging time for policing. Events over the past several years have caused many to question the actions of our officers, and tragically have undermined the trust that the public must and should have in their police departments. At times such as this, it is our role as leaders to assess the situation and take the steps necessary to move forward. This morning, I would like to address one issue that I believe will help both our profession and our communities. The history of the law enforcement profession is replete with examples of bravery, self-sacrifice, and service to the community. At its core, policing is a noble profession made up of men and women who are sworn to place themselves between the innocent and those who seek to do them harm. Over the years, thousands of police officers have laid down their lives for their fellow citizens, while hundreds of thousands more have been injured while protecting their communities. The nation owes all of these officers, as well as those who are still on patrol today, an enormous debt of gratitude. At the same time, however, it is also clear that the history of policing has had darker periods. There have been times when law enforcement officers, because of the laws enacted by federal, state, and local governments, have been the face of oppression to far too many of our fellow citizens. In the past, the laws adopted by our society have required police officers to perform many unpalatable tasks, such as ensuring legalized discrimination or even denying the basic rights of citizenship to many of our fellow Americans. While this is no longer the case, this dark side of our shared history has created a generational, almost inherited mistrust between many communities of color and the law enforcement agencies that serve them. Many officers who do not share this common heritage often struggle to comprehend the reasons behind this historic mistrust. As a result, they are often unable to bridge this gap and connect with some segments of their communities. While we obviously cannot change the past, it is also clear that we must change the future. We must move forward together to build a shared understanding. We must forge a path that allows us to move beyond our history and identify common solutions to better protect our communities. For our part, the first step in this process is for the law enforcement profession and the IACP to acknowledge and apologize for the actions of the past and the role that our profession has played in society's historical mistreatment of communities of color. At the same time, those who denounce the police must also acknowledge that today's officers are not to blame for the injustices of the past. If either side in this debate fails to acknowledge these fundamental truths, we will be unable to move beyond the past. Overcoming this historic mistrust requires that we must move forward together in an atmosphere of mutual respect. All members of our society must realize that we have a mutual obligation to work together to ensure fairness, dignity, security, and justice. It is my hope that by working together, we can break this historic cycle of mistrust and build a better and safer future for us all. Thank you.
So, as I was there, and just to set some context for that particular speech, this was in San Diego at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference. And Chief Cunningham delivered that speech in front of the delegation there, which included high-ranking federal people in law enforcement, state and local. I find myself listening to that, being pushed and pulled and tugged in so many ways. At times I'm going this way, and at times I'm going that way. And I will also disclose that after he made that speech, some high-ranking law enforcement officials walked out. Some law enforcement members stood and applauded. And I bring this to you because of the breadth and comprehensiveness of the ways your experiences and your research talks about and has explored police and given humanity and voice to those who are incarcerated. And I just want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on your impressions of that video.
Well, I'm happy to step in here. First, I acknowledge that in this video, There is some recognition of the history of policing, but one of the things that's missing is the role of personal agency, okay? He talks about things as if they are in the past, but there is ample evidence today of problems and issues and concerns and steps taken by officers that have been detrimental. In a democracy, one of the most important relationships is between citizens and police. When legitimacy and trust are eroded, safety is eroded. And I think that the comments don't go far enough in terms of recognizing that we need to do more. It's not as simple as coming together in this circumstance. We need to ensure that the voices of the community are heard, but not just heard, that law enforcement is working with community. And I give two examples here of where I think he misses the boat a little bit. In that example of the traffic stops in that community, which the data was provided by the police agency, African Americans represent 0.1% of the population in this 2.1 square mile area. They made up 36% of traffic stops. Rather than look at that data and say, we need to take a look at what our officers are doing, the community doubled down and said, I didn't know what I was doing analyzing the data. Well, it's not all that hard to run percentages. It wasn't a sophisticated analysis. And what I was told by some residents in that community is we have the kind of policing we, the residents, want. And our community is safer because of all of those stops. In another community with a different policing agency, they took a look at their data and said, we need to go into the community and connect and have conversation and answer the difficult questions. So when he talks about these things being in the past, two agencies, same region, similar types of problems, different responses. One community doubles down and says, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, there's nothing wrong with it, despite the fact that black and brown faces were the predominant group being stopped, not because their driving was a safety risk. In another community, the policing agency says, we need to do more, we need to be better, we need to be out there connecting in order to build trust. So I think it's great in the video that he acknowledges the history of policing, but now what? And there are agencies who are responding, who are stepping up, who are doing more than simply acknowledging.
There's so much to unpack from that video and what's already been said. If you were paying attention to my face, you probably saw a few expressions because personally and intellectually, it angers me. The police are a component of government, a reflection of government in a society, and the police are also a reflection of our society. Building off of something Martha just said, community, we have some really complex relationships because what we see and what we experience through American policing is a reflection of what our society has wanted or has been willing to tolerate for decades. It was powerful that there was an acknowledgement to a darker period. But that was also a lie, because it suggests that it is something in the past versus something that is ongoing today. And the fact that we have data to show, or data that matches up with so many testimonies that we can put together. It's good that that data puts us in a position for a greater acknowledgement of the ills through American policing. But when we still engage in the mythology of policing, one of the first things, that it's a noble profession that everyone who goes into chooses to be this honorable officer, and they go into it to be a champion of justice. That myth, the myth that everybody who goes into education and teaching does it for the love of helping students, and that everybody who joins the military is a super patriot waiting for their opportunity to serve. These myths have consequences. There's a reality that policing is a job. It's a good job for some people, and not everybody in policing is there to do justice or even enforce the law evenly. We have this conundrum. How can we have all of these noble, aware officers working in policing where we continue to have all of these stories come out, all of these cases where bad things are happening? So how is it that we have so many noble, good officers concerned about the community, ignoring all the problems that are going on by their fellow officers and within their agencies? And I want to pass the mic on, but I want to share this perspective. I too work with data and work with police departments. And every police department that I go into, we end up having a candid conversation. If you talk to any police executive, particularly in private, and you say, hey, do you know who your problem officers are? Oh, they can tell you in a heartbeat. I always refer to them as Officer Schmitty. If you have someone in your life with a nickname Schmitty or full name Schmitty, I apologize to you. But it's always Officer Schmitty. And everybody knows that if a stop happens and it's a stop that involves Schmitty, if it's in Schmitty's beat, Schmitty's been working for the longest time, everybody knows about the Schmittys and their agency. Yet, little is being done about them to stop them from behaving like an Officer Schmitty. So even within policing, you could be at that conference and you would have police executives talking about, oh yeah, my problem, Schmitty, and they will share stories about how they're dealing with the person who's disproportionately generating stops. So when you go look into the data, and if you're able to get into the data and go down to the officer level, it's not surprising that you may find, or it would not be that surprising for you to find that not only are we seeing this disparity, but you're able to identify where it's happening and who is involved in the stops or the encounters where the complaints are disproportionately happening, where the stops are disproportionately happening. Yet, for a lot of reasons, we can't terminate Schmitty, we can't move Schmitty, we can't get rid of the Schmittys. And at some point, we have to wonder, do our agencies genuinely want to get rid of them?
Kim, your thoughts? Kim?
I concur with both panelists. I think about IACP because I think about the demographics that he's talking to. So he's talking to a room full of cops. It'd be interesting to see if he would say have the same message if he was speaking to a room of community members. And so I think his speech is a nice one. It was tailored for the demographics that he was speaking to. But I take issue to the fact that he thinks it's the past, and it's not present when every day we turn on the news and we see what's happening in various communities throughout the U.S. And it's shocking stuff. It seems like almost that things have gotten worse as opposed to better. And so that's why, I try my best to work within these police departments to help them from a recruitment standpoint, from an auditing standpoint, from a monitoring standpoint, and from an investigation standpoint. Frankly, doing the investigations of police officers and looking at their patterns, looking at their history, is very helpful in basically presenting to the executive team for those departments exactly what their issues are, and being very prevalent about what they need to do about those issues. And then from a incarcerated population standpoint, the same thing needs to happen. We need to ensure that the same relationship building that we're doing with our community members outside of our correctional facilities is happening within our correctional facilities. We need to make sure that their voices are heard too, because they are a very important part of the community. So I have issue with his statement, but I understand the demographics that he's talking to, and so that he tailored his speech for those demographics.
So several of you have mentioned some of the egregious, high-profile things that have hit the news and the media. But we know if we're talking about policing impact on incarceration, that almost always begins at that street-level interaction between a police officer and a community member. What about the stories, the spiraling negative impact on the stories that don't make the news? When the data of and I think, Martha, you made mention of a traffic stop that has no nexus to really community safety. But if we could talk about the impact of what does that ticket do for someone in these communities that doesn't necessarily make the news.
One of the things that I found in which I really wasn't aware, again, most of my work was focused on the incarcerated or the formerly incarcerated, was just the impact of these stops, right? And it's not just a stop. To a black or brown person, given the history, given all that has happened, you end up with a situation where even if you don't receive the ticket, it has potentially a psychological impact, right? But if you receive the ticket and there's a charge, it can trigger so many other things, because if I don't have the funds to pay that ticket, what then happens? What are those spiraling sorts of effects that goes from a ticket that I can't pay to fees added on to now I have to come down and go to court for this ticket and I don't have the money to pay that fee. And so you can end up just from a traffic stop with this financial spiral that pulls you away from being able to go to work, so now you might lose your job, right? Or you can't pay the fine because you need to buy food. And so we need to think about traffic stops that have nothing to do with safety and ask ourselves, at the lowest level, should we ask officers to engage in those behaviors? Should we ask officers to make those stops? Some communities have moved away from this, by the way, who've said, you know, if the driving isn't creating a public safety risk, we're not going to stop. Other communities, by the way, are dependent on the finances from those stops. Okay, so if you look at some of the critical legal studies literature, they talk about the financial piece of this, where you have a small community that might have a very small court system, that now you've got to find a way to pay for a judge, and you've got to find a way to pay for that small community legal system. How do you do that? Well, in some communities, it's through these fines for stops that have nothing to do with public safety risk. One of the things they found in looking at Ferguson, Missouri, and then I'll pass the mic, was that there seemed to be an emphasis on mandating traffic stops to increase revenue. Those stops, again, were not for driving that puts someone at risk. It might be for a taillight out. It might be for failure to use a turn signal. It might be, and there are all these fees. And in the one community that I did work in, I looked at their fee structure. It was $150 if you were ticketed for things related to equipment on your vehicle. $145 for this, $50 for that. If I'm already in a situation where I cannot support my family financially or are struggling, that's $150 I don't have. So now I'm going to get a warrant. And so we have to think about these impacts at the lowest level, as Rodney suggested. It's bigger than just the stop. And so if a warrant is issued, what happens if I go to jail because I wasn't able to pay all of these fines? And now I'm out of work, and now I can't support my family. It becomes a vicious cycle. And that's one of the things, again, that many people don't realize about the process. And so I'll just defer to one of the others to.
Thank you. We have so many challenges. We tend to pay greater attention to high-profile cases, a shooting, an incident involving use of force in a very serious way, to the point that, and as it relates to incarceration, we tend to pay attention to wrongful convictions when the individual is wrongfully convicted and they're on death row or they're serving life in prison. We lose sight of the fact on the incarceration or imprisonment side, there are people who plead guilty and they're not, and they're wrongfully convicted, and they get just a few years, or they get probation. They're still processed by the system and put in the system, and it's done so wrongfully, but because of our preoccupation with someone being wrongfully convicted and potentially being executed, which would be one of the most egregious thing to happen, it takes on the face of what wrongful conviction means. And when it comes to policing, well, if you did not get killed, shot, beaten, then we give everything else a pass. We, for so long, have not paid attention to the inappropriate things that happen, the stop that should not happen, the data that does not show, even if we were to go with this approach, the data that shows, okay, we stopped you, searched you, interrogated you, and found no evidence of any wrongdoing, okay, we just push that aside. That's some of the things that's been happening with the data over the years. It has been, I think, phenomenal that since about 1995 and the racial profiling era and in policing research, we're paying attention to the data. We're getting access to data that's helping us look at these things and contradict some narratives. The narrative that, well, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to worry about. But we still ignore how these things erode trust. We still ignore how policing, business as usual, is still bringing people into the system. And it's been so interesting to me how many people in the room here have heard of the prison industrial complex? Have you heard much of the term, the policing industrial complex? Sorry. We don't talk about policing as somehow an industrial complex. Police militarization? Policing, our focus has been shifted to what's wrong. It's been shifted to this issue of, is policing militarized or too militarized? Are they getting access to equipment that allows them to take a more warlike approach to communities? And we totally miss the point that it's a job, it's a government function that generates a lot of money, similar to the prison industrial complex and corrections. A lot of people are making a good living off of imprisonment and incarceration and justice system processing. Well, that starts at the stage of policing, and we don't talk enough about the revenue side of policing for policing itself and how that supports our court systems and programs, because the revenue that comes in from, oh, not only were you speeding, but you have this equipment violation, or you're not wearing your seatbelt, and as Martha pointed out, And that's a big problem for us. I'll end with, there is a growing movement, and a significant movement, looking at misdemeanor justice, debtors' jails and prisons, the reality that we have more people who are involved in the system because of the financial consequences of them being processed, and then it starts a feed loop. Warrants for not showing up to court, warrants for not paying fines. People, when they come in or they're arrested, they stay in the system longer. So we're starting to pay attention to it through that, I don't want to say lens, through that understanding. But the sooner we get real with recognizing that we have a justice industrial complex, and that we pay the same kind of attention that we to policing that we have to mass incarceration, I think we'll be further along the road of improving things.
Can I just add one thing here, okay? We're focused on policing, but on this revenue side, we also ought to be talking about local government officials. You can have a police department, if every officer in that department was not biased, if the local government has a mandate and wants enforcement in order to generate revenue, you're still going to end up potentially with disproportionality, because who ends up having the equipment issues? Who ends up unable to pay the fine? So understand that this is bigger than just a policing issue when we talk about these fines for things related to driving a car that are not a threat to public safety. The mandate may be coming from local government officials to actively enforce those driving-related things that generate revenue. And so it's much more complicated than people realize sometimes when we look at that local level interaction and we think about this financial piece.
Great.
I'm going to be a bit of a devil's advocate. I think that I don't look at it so much as a revenue generated piece, because police departments, law enforcement across this country have access to millions of dollars via the Justice Department. And so there is a grant for everything they want to do, including purchasing the military equipment, which, if it's not donated to them. So through donations and grants, they have at their means millions of dollars that many agencies within the government do not have access to. On the other note, data. Data is very important when you collect it yourself, but when you're using the actual police data, to be frank, data can be manipulated. Data can show whatever law enforcement departments want it to show. And so unless you have access to that raw data and you're able to actually analyze it yourself, sometimes it's not absolutely the way it presents itself. And I'll give an example. So we talk about stops, traffic stops. So many departments now have created a procedure, directive, general order, they call it different things, around what officers should collect as it relates to traffic stops. And that is a person's demographics, because that's the way they determine if a department is doing racial profiling. Well, the traffic stops and that data that they collect is due to or subject to the actual officer's perception or what the officer wants to put down on that actual record. And so if the officer has stopped a black person, but the officer does not want to say that, then the officer can put in that officer stopped a white person. So the data can be manipulated. And let's be very clear about that. And police departments, more sophisticated and larger police departments, know that that's the case. And so we have to be very careful about the data The one thing I like about what law enforcement departments have adopted are their body-worn camera programs, because that is where, if you are in a state or in a city where you can access body-worn cameras through their FOIA laws or open records laws, you can actually watch the body-worn camera yourself. And in my line of work, I watch it all the time. And I can actually see the officer's actions. I can see what's going on. I can see what the communication was, whether it was fair. I can determine if certain officers are pattern officers as it relates to how they are engaging the community. And this is also going on in our in correctional facilities. More and more correctional officers are starting to wear body-worn cameras, and that's a good thing. And so that's where I think we can get most of our data or most of our information about those interactions.
Great. I want to share one thing about my background that I think is important for this conversation. I have a background in hostage negotiations. I was a hostage negotiator for many years. I taught it as an adjunct professor, and I was brought into a lot of businesses to talk to CEOs about what to do if you're taken hostage. And I share that because one of the things that I would teach in terms of surviving a hostage taking is, if you have an opportunity to speak to your captor, speak to them, humanize yourself to them, because it's difficult to harm someone when you see them as a human. And so, Brother Brown, I appreciate you sharing your personal story within your family. And it brings me to ask this particular question. With the research and experiences and the perspectives that you have, what is emerging out there that you see as beneficial, optimistic, in terms of, excuse me, humanizing or destigmatizing those who are incarcerated?
Are we talking in general, or are we talking about this in the context of policing?
However you choose to answer it.
I want to try to stay in the pocket of policing. So I think some of the good things that we see happening, more and more agencies are starting to pay attention to trauma-informed training. And by officers recognizing that trauma can be real for others and for themselves, and digging deeper into how trauma is relevant and how it can influence the way people behave, I think that that's something that's very powerful. So that's something that I will say is for the good. Something I'm going to say that is in the middle, implicit bias training. I think that, I believe a lot of people have heard about that or are aware of that. I think that getting more and more justice officials, law enforcement officials, or actors to understand that there's this thing known as implicit bias. Just because you are not openly or explicitly biased toward a group, translation, you're not openly racist, that does not mean that a person cannot hold feelings, have thoughts that they subconsciously act upon, or maybe with some consciousness, but with blinders on. Some individuals might not realize that because of their biases, they approach situations a certain way and they treat people a certain way. I think implicit bias training is good in that it has been very successful in getting officers to recognize that biases can exist, they can be real, and they're important. I think implicit bias is also problematic on at least two fronts. The first front, it creates this, I think, false dichotomy that you are either, and forgive me for showing my age, you're either Archie Bunker racist, you're either a raging racist, Ku Klux Klan member, spewing all type of vitriol, and you're working as a police officer and acting upon it, or you're okay, because everybody's got biases. So you're biased, I'm biased, everybody's biased, so it's okay to be biased. I think that's one of the dangers of implicit bias training, at least the way it was ruled out early on. And related to that early rollout, a lot of the people who engaged in implicit bias training and a lot of the agencies that invested in implicit bias training, do you remember maybe when you were young, when it would rain And there would always be that person that would kick the tree, water would fall from the leaves, and the person that would kick that tree would run away and not get wet. Well, implicit bias trainers in training, some people come in, well-trained individuals, they come in, they help the agency and individuals in the agency understand that implicit bias is real, and then they go. And a lot of organizations invest in the initial training, but do not invest in the follow-up. Because it's also dangerous. I mean, imagine an agency that could somehow have actual data, hard data, on how biased this officer is opposed to that officer, and even going through training, an individual has not moved to a different point. So it's great that we have this investment in recognizing bias and bias-based policing, but it's problematic when we do not take the next step in, okay, what's the follow-up training? You help me understand that I might have biases or that I do, but you have not invested in helping me address those biases. The thing that causes me a great deal of concern, that third thing, compliance training. There is a growing movement to work with communities to help young people, and particularly young minorities and young minority males, to understand how to survive the encounter, survive the stop, live to tell the tale. Complain later, comply now, complain later. And I have been guilty of giving similar words in my classroom when students ask me what to do about a police stop. It's like, hey, do what you need to do to live the tale, humanize, be respectful, be compliant, and don't run, don't fight. And why I say this is a concern as I move down, we are engaging in what I argue is a form of propaganda where we are formally trying to teach citizens that it's not in their best interest to stand up, even when they know they're right. And that we are structuring this. We're investing funds. You can get grants to do this training. You get communities, from citizen groups to local officials, to say, hey, isn't this great? We're doing officer friendly, and we're bringing police officers in, and we're making this connection, and we're trying to build trust. And as we're doing this, we tell you, take this class of shut up and never question, never stand up for yourself, even if it's happening to you right then and there, because the system, officers will always win. And the only way you can effectively fight is to try to fight another day by lodging a complaint and hoping that you have a civilian review mechanism that will be effective. Or the police department internally, through its professional standards office, has mechanisms that you can bring about change for what Officer Schmitty did to you. And I think that it's very dangerous when we tilt to the point of telling people, don't even stand up for yourself, even if you know that your rights are being violated, because we have to tell people, live to tell the tale. So thank you for the extended.
Well, this is, as we started off by saying, there's so much to unpack as it relates to these perspectives. But the beauty of what we're doing today is we're giving voice to people, and we're giving voice and recognition to the impact that police encounters, police oversight, mechanisms for accountability. You mentioned, Kim, about selection. That's awesome to recognize, and you talk about retention as it relates to Officer Smitty. But want to hear from the audience. I think we have the ability to have some questions asked of us. Do we have a microphone to go away? I see some hands that are up.
I'd like to hear your feedback on this question that I've been thinking about. So people who are JDs or who have law degrees have professional obligations to tell the truth and to have the ability to interact with the court system. Judges also. But I want to know what you think about the fact that when police solve crimes, they have no obligation to tell the truth, and they are only interested in closure rates. And so that does not build trust. That is inherently something. So I want to know what you think about the fact that when police do their investigations, they have no obligation to tell the truth in any regard because they're only interested in ferreting out the information that they're pursuing. That is a fundamental basis. I want to know what you think about the basis of you can't have trust in that situation. So we have a historical legacy of 30, 40 years of these kinds of false arrest warrants, not undue traffic tickets, but massive corruption within the department to arrest people who have no power to fight back. And that's passed down from generation to generation of police officers. So what do you do with that level of trust that has been so, dissolved between us?
So one thing you said, they have no obligation. They do have an obligation. It's whether they're held accountable for the obligation. And that's the key. We have to have conversations and we have to hold the leadership responsible when officers aren't held accountable for their obligations, for their directives. Every police department has a directive that an officer is supposed to be truthful and honest in their investigations. And, well, it's true. What I'm saying is that from an accountability standpoint, they need to be held accountable for that actual directive. And so that's why we need to hold our leadership accountable. We need to hold our city officials, our government officials that employ the leadership accountable. We need to hold our court systems accountable. It's a huge global issue across the U.S. And so but I want to make sure we understand that police officers do have a directive, to be honest.
They don't. That's not how they conduct their investigations, and the U.S. Supreme Court has said specifically that they don't have to tell the truth in their investigations.
I agree with you.
And so it's a fundamental core issue of how we interact with that community when we're interacting with police. Because they take us into interrogation rooms and then they lie to us. And they have said that they can do that. And they arrest every young 14-year-old and 15-year-old boy in the community. And it doesn't matter if they're autistic. It doesn't matter if they're vulnerable. All that matters is that they want to get a conviction because of inherent bias. That's what's happened to our communities.
Right, and that's why we have civilian oversight of law enforcement to hold them accountable for things when they violate their procedures and when they violate the directives that they are supposed to be abiding by. And so the only way we can do that is through community engagement, and we have to put leadership in the room and talk with community members like yourself and talk about your experiences so that they understand from a practical standpoint exactly what you've experienced.
If I may, I think you're both right. You would be hard-pressed to find in a modern or professional police department any of their standard operating procedures where it's written lie, cheat, steal when you interrogate, and you don't have to follow the rules and such. So when you're at the department level, everything on paper is square, and they're told that they're supposed to act with integrity, honesty, and such. And you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court has said that when there have been challenges that have risen to that level, the police are still within fair lanes if they lie, cheat, do some things, mislead an individual, and in the course of arresting them and moving them on. And we have this problem. And this is something that I'm glad that has been talked about in this during this symposium. We're talking about complex spaces and navigating complex spaces and working with complex spaces, because I think all three of us, we're in agencies, or we've had access to, or four of us, I should say, we've had access to agencies that have done, at the local level, some pretty shitty stuff. Mm-hmm. They're not following the spirit, and they're maximizing the fact that the Supreme Court has basically said, you guys have a lot of leeway to do a lot of things. And I agree with you that for anybody who's aware of this, how can you trust the police when you know that when they say, come on, I'm going to help you, just tell me what happened, juxtaposed against anyone with legal training Do not talk to them without representation. Do not admit to something. Do not consent to certain things, because once you do that, you put yourself at risk of that information being used to further manipulate or convict you. So our challenge is, how do we educate more people about the do's and don'ts when interacting with the police? How do we put the public and those who are really concerned in a better position to try to change things? We've succeeded through policing standards and professionalization and getting organizations on paper to lay out all the right rules. But it's going to take things happening at a legislative level and at a judicial appointment level for there to be an interpretation of those things to a point where we finally put appropriate fences around police conduct. What do you think?
Nicole?
Well, I want to thank this panel, because most policing panels, it's almost like that speech that Rodney played, where you kind of are cringing because it's so the antithesis of what's actually happening. Just one comment about the video. I thought it was amazing that the officer kept blaming the federal government. Like, we're just enacting the federal laws. And I'm thinking, well, nobody told the officers that beat Tyree Carr to act like that. I mean, there's no federal, like, please approach somebody and then beat them until they die, right? That is the officer discretion at the scene. And that is where the inherent trouble seems to happen. So I just, I'm just impressed, and I want to just thank Rodney for his leadership too, because this is the type of intellectual discussion that I was hoping we'd have when we bring you here. So it's just such amazing. It's a very shift in the wind. I thought it was impressive about this lying with data aspect. In Connecticut, there was officers that fudged 300 tickets, driving tickets that didn't happen. And so the New York Times called to talk with me about this. And I said, the most interesting part of it is not the lying and the fudging of data and the manufacturing of so-called truths, right? It's the fact that when they did it, they made it seem that they were oversampling and giving tickets to white people. And so I've talked about racist intent. It is not enough to talk about implicit bias, because implicit bias makes it seem like my brain malfunctioned, whoopee. This is a calculated, well thought out. I mean, if I had to fudge something with data or give that assignment to my students, I'd be very impressed if they came back and were able to do it. It takes thought, very deliberative practices, discretion, and the know-how that you will not get in trouble when you do it, right? And so far, they're not doing anything to hold those officers accountable. So I would love for some of the panelists to talk about that, because we sometimes live and die by the data. If the data doesn't show it, we can't say it, right? But the police can say whatever they want. I mean, they can say, hey, I think this 7-year-old committed a sexual assault and a murder, which has happened in Chicago. And that is enough without even physical evidence or DNA to tie that child to that murder and rape, even though it doesn't make sense to us. And we don't have data about police-involved encounters. My cousin had a gun put to his head by our officers off duty, and they said, who are they gonna believe, you or me? And a 15-year-old Chicano boy that had, hanging with his friends, so open container, does that warrant a trauma of a gun to your head? I mean, that's like a war crime. So how do we think about data when it's so easily manipulated and often helps the police tell their own stories?
Well, police departments strategically collect data that they want to collect. And so one of the things that I try to do in my profession is I point out data that needs to be collected when they don't want to collect it. So when you talk about the firearm, a lot of departments don't want to collect when they pull their gun, because they justify, well, we may pull our gun several times. Well, we want to know about how many times you pull your gun. A lot of departments don't want to report how many times they point their gun. Well, we want to know how many times you point your gun. And so the key is to get departments more and more, whether it's through the local level, state level, or federal level, there's been a lot of talk about uniform standards for policing. And so if we ever get to that point, hopefully that will be one of the uniform standards, that every time an officer pulls their gun or every time an officer points their gun, that has to be reported. And with body-worn cameras, it's clear now, because the technology that's out there is every time they pull that gun, that camera comes on. And so more and more departments are considering that, but I can tell you there is a lot of pushback on that, because they do not want folks to know when they're pulling their guns.
I would just kind of add to this question about data. In the project that I was working on, they had an issue because it was their data that showed that 30% of the stops were for persons of color, and they said it was flawed. And the next thought for me was, how many more people were stopped in that community where there was no record of that stop? No record existed. They were also doing some things around the coding of race in policing is another one of those issues, because as Kim said earlier, it's officer perceptions of which box to check. And there's wide variation in the number and types of boxes available across agencies. And so again, there are these issues with the data. And so you can't just focus on official statistics. In the case of that small community, when the story got out about this report, those calls that were coming in were from people in the community who said, I'm a delivery driver, and I was stopped for delivering food and asked about being a person of color in that community. There were professional people who said they were stopped. I mean, again, that community is very, very small. And so the data was actually most likely undercounting the number of stops for persons of color. And so the data isn't the end all and be all. I think community voices matter. And this speaks to your question as well. When communities are activated, and they start turning out at government meetings and asking the questions that you're asking, if you get enough of those residents activating and responding, people start listening. People start, in government, start wondering, okay, am I going to get reelected? And so we have to think about, how do we get more community voices heard? And in the wake of the one community's response, I was asked by another police agency to help them in the community. And I want to talk just briefly about that project, where my starting place was, if that department wanted to improve relationships with that marginalized community, they needed to meet people where they are. And what that meant wasn't simply showing up at community events. It meant showing up. It meant allowing that opportunity for community voices to be heard and to take it when they said, we don't like what you're doing. It meant that they needed to involve the community residents in the prioritization of crime problems, because what we often do is go into communities and tell them, this is what's wrong in your community. Gun violence is a problem in your community. In this project, the residents said, we're not as concerned about the gun violence, because we know that what's happening is people are coming into our neighborhood and they're stopping on this street and that street, and it's not our residents who are involved in the gun violence. What we are concerned about, drugs, traffic. Traffic was number one. And those residents started turning up at city council meetings saying, we want police to address these particular things. And law enforcement started to respond in that community. Not every agency would take that approach. Full scale, we want voices to be heard. We're going to do everything we can to get a variety of residents in this marginalized community to share their concerns, because traditional surveys won't do it. Right? Most cities do a survey and they ask how satisfied residents are with the police. Marginalized communities don't even have access to internet in some places. They aren't going to return those surveys because they have so much mistrust in government. So that agency was willing to set up opportunities for voices to be heard in locations in the community. And so I think if we want to shift, if we want to address, if we want to bring together, community voices matter. It's how do you activate those voices in communities that have been isolated and marginalized and where there's such mistrust. The only way to do that is you got to go to the people. And so an agency that's willing to take those steps is a much more progressive agency, is one that maybe they're going to be more likely when a pattern emerges to respond. But not all agencies are there.
Something I want to, something I feel is really important to note. Body-worn cameras can be a really good thing. I'm a supporter of body-worn cameras. But we need to be very mindful of where that has taken us. If it's not on tape, did it actually happen? It's created a burden of proof to a point where if it's not on tape and if it's not clear in the recording, well, then the tie goes to the police department or the police officer. So the more and more we're using data, whether the data is in the form of video or if we're using numbers, and when it comes to numbers and statistics, I've seen so many situations where folks have gotten distracted, and Martha's talking a bit about this, with the methodology or the statistical analysis. We can, from a policy perspective, get so caught up in chasing statistical significance, and as criminal justice and criminology both become stronger and stronger disciplines, and more peer-reviewed scholarship is going on about police encounters with individuals on the streets. It can be so easy to focus on significance levels and the techniques that were used to identify possible disparities, and then debates about what the data actually mean, that we lose sight of the fact that we have this kind of acceptable losses, a tolerance of inefficiency, a tolerance of inappropriate actions by police departments that, well, of course there's going to be some disparity because, well, they're deployed here, they're deployed there, that we easily get moved away from the point of policing is not working the way many people want it to, and not acknowledging policing is arguably working the way it was designed to work, with the poor and the naturally tan experiencing policing in its more negative ways. But now that we're focusing on statistical significance as a way of proving disparities, we're focusing on that red dot and we're not looking right in front of us to this reality that we have an ongoing system that's not working for some people. The voices are louder and we're paying attention to the voices in a way that we never have, and that is great. But it's so easy to get distracted by some numbers or some techniques or explanations of, well, we could not clearly see it from the video, so I just wanted to, again, a cautionary note. We need to be careful about how vested we are in the data in improving our points.
More questions. Before I get to that question, I just wanted to, just as it relates to the questions we've had so far, we have to acknowledge that there still remains, even with the most proactive, well-intentioned officers, there still remains a power construct within the policing field that's hidden behind and cloaked behind things such as the union itself, law enforcement Bill of Rights, qualified immunity, and things of that nature that still exist and makes this work so difficult. But I appreciate all of the contributions to that conversation.
Oh, yeah, great discussion. My question revolves around my personal family. So I did a project with Columbia University Oral History Archive, interviewing family members that's been some association with mass incarceration, from ex-convicts to correctional officers to police officers, all in one bunch, one family. My question is, one of my relatives, who's a police officer, right? I'm interviewing him, and he's in a violent crime unit in North Carolina, right? And he told me one thing, and I wanted to get you guys some, if you can explain it to me. He told me he's got a lot of power with his badge, right? I didn't question him on it, but I just wanted to ask you guys, what is the change when I'm a civilian and then I'm issued this badge? It just it changes. So what changes behind the scenes where this person is a civilian in the neighborhood and now he has a badge where he can do things? So tell me, what's that in between from being a civilian to getting that badge and being able to act on with your badge?
Rodney?
Great, I was hoping that, well, our panel would do that.
You're the cop.
But I will say one of the things that I'm excited about that our panel brought to the forefront of this discussion is taking it to the people and finding out what the people want. Far too often, law enforcement is doled out to communities. We do policing, we do law enforcement, but we don't do it in conjunction with the community or with respect to the voices of the community as to how they want to be policed. And in many instances, as Martha alluded to, in many instances, and I would probably say in most instances, people want to have a voice in how they're policed and are willing to be in partnership and willing to be collaborative with their police if they can build some level of trust with them. And that trust comes from the hard work, going to where they are, giving them an opportunity to, with what resources they have, what they have accessible to them, giving them a legitimate seat at the table and voice in what it is that they want to see. And oftentimes, well-intended approaches, we want to reduce gun violence, isn't what the community wants. I want to be able to safely walk across the street. I want traffic, and I want to do something about drugs. We know the guns are coming from some other place, but we don't get to that place until we have that hard work, boots on the ground type of work that Martha was speaking of. Does that help with what you were looking at?
That in between the person being a civilian and becoming an officer, it changed. The psychology changed. I'm no longer a civilian. I'm a police officer, and I can approach you and do things to you. So the science behind it. I know there's got to be something with police training. And now you got the badge, carrying a gun 24 hours a day. You can do stuff.
Well, great point. So can one of you speak about the programs that we have or that you've had experience with where we are reaching new police officers and putting them in the prisons and having the demystifying interaction between the two to address that? There are new police officers, they're coming from civilian status to becoming a police officer, and this is happening in the police academy itself.
So I know of a program at Duquesne University in Pennsylvania called Police Training Inside Out. And so the Inside Out exchange is not a new concept, right? That's college students actually going into the prisons and being educated alongside of the prisoners. But now Dr. Norman Conti has a program where he's actually taking new recruits and having them go into the prisons, and they actually educate the new recruits along with the prisoners, along with the incarcerated persons, and teach them about interaction. And they also learn from each other's perspective about the encounters that they have, or that they had with the police. And so it's been a successful program thus far. And so it's something that hopefully, I think, catches on throughout the U.S. Because again, from a community standpoint, I've done this on the community side, not necessarily from an incarcerated person's standpoint, but it can be so impactful, as Rodney mentioned, when you have community members and police around the table and you don't have police officers saying what you're going to do, or as Robert mentioned, the compliance training piece, but actually listening to the other side and understanding what their interpretation of the interaction is with that law enforcement officer. Now, from another perspective, I understand exactly what you're saying. You take a civilian, and now you put that person through the academy. Different departments have different lengths of time for their academy training, and now all of a sudden they're given a badge, and then they're a cop. And there's no clear answer to that because different departments look at that different ways. Our more progressive departments are going to ensure that that officer understands how important community policing is, and understanding that whatever beat or patrol that they have, they should know who their community members are and what those concerns are in the community. You should know if you have a person, in one house that maybe has some mental health issues, and understand that you may have some interaction with them that it shouldn't lead to that person being locked up. But there are other departments, frankly, that don't take it as seriously, community policing as seriously. And they tell an officer, once they get that badge, that you are now an officer and your uniform and your badge is a form of a compliance. I had a chief tell me that once, that community members need to understand that our uniform is, and it wasn't in Alexandria, I don't want to put Alexandria on, but that our uniform is a form of compliance. And I had a very deep discussion with that chief to let him know that the uniform means nothing to me. The uniform means nothing to a community member, other than that you're a police officer and that you should be ensuring my public safety. But as far as complying, you're just another person that I see walking down the street. And so there are a lot of departments that still think that way, and unfortunately that still teach that way. And we can only do our best at trying to change that train of thought, and that's what we're trying to do through civilian oversight of policing.
I would just add, the departments that I've been involved with recently have started with the recruits before they ever leave the academy, acclimating them to the communities that they will be expected to be involved with. And in one instance, they're requiring those recruits to create and follow through with the development of community-based projects in those neighborhoods. So they get to know the people before they even leave the academy. And that agency is talking about and finding ways to get officers and citizens in the room together in dialogue with one another. Absolutely. So that it becomes less about the power of the uniform, the power of the badge, and more about each other as humans. And until we start seeing a larger number of agencies engaging in those types of strategies, I think you're still going to have this sort of the badge, the power of the badge, the power of the uniform. But we can't change things overnight.
And this is a great start, and so we're really out of time. Yes. This.
She was. Yeah. She had her hand up. She did. She did.
And I'm going to try to get it right.
All right.
Policing grew out of slave patrols.
Absolutely. Yes.
So let's ground us in who police came to be, where they grew up from.
That's right. Yeah.
I want to go, fast forward to Ferguson and what you talked about the fines and fees. And this is the masses of our communities all across the U.S. So at A New Way of Life, we published a report called Not Just the Ferguson Problem, where we trace the money with fines and fees to judges' pensions in Los Angeles. We then launched legislation to get millions and millions and millions of dollars forgiven from fines and fees, warrants taken back. You know, it was a short process, but we were able to do this in Los Angeles through a new way of life because we got a few resources. And until communities, foundations, government, city, county, or whoever begin to resource us to be able to dismantle some of this purging of our communities, these aggressions, both micro and macro, and take back some of our power and our freedom to just live. So I guess this is a call out to ask you, how do we equip communities to be able to begin to help their own community, their members, you know, not to be purged, you know, not to be hidden, not to have to hide because they got a warrant because they couldn't afford to get their tail light fixed, you know, or they jaywalked, or whatever it is. How do we begin to build a movement to actually resource communities to be able to do that deep dive into how they're getting purged and paying for judges' pensions, paying for these other things through counties and cities across this great nation? Sorry for that little pun, but I had to throw something in there. You know, but you know, so for anyone that's watching, I'm calling out to them because we can do the work to have a level of accountability. We can do the work to bring resources back and stop the suppression and oppression of our community members if we have the support and resources. This is a hotbed. You know, I'm gonna be good and get the mic back to her. So
I'm deferring to them.
But how do we build that type of movement? You know, because it's not just the Ferguson problem. It's a national problem, and you spoke to it somewhat. Ooh, it's hot.
Can I just, okay.
And then we'll have to-
We do not need police officers to control traffic. Part of the problem in American society is that police are social workers, police are in schools, police are everywhere where they do not need to be. We need citizens controlling traffic. We don't need a RoboCop, literally a RoboCop, telling our children how to cross the street. The question is, how can you police police who live within a culture wherein when police themselves stand up for what's right, they get challenged, their lives get threatened, and they literally have to go underground. The cop who exposed stop and frisk in New York is still underground because the cops are going to kill him for ratting them out. So we're talking about a culture, which connects to what you were saying, that's irreparable. And because it's irreparable, given its origins in slave patrols and policing class society, the cops emerged in the 19th century, really, as the working class in this country is beginning to engage in labor struggle. And the cops are essentially there to keep a lid on class conflict and to keep brown and black people in their place in the ghetto. And we've expanded the power of the police beyond anything that makes sense. The reason why we have mass incarceration, which is hyper-incarceration of black and brown people, you don't get 2.4 million people in prison without putting more cops in the streets and giving them power and telling them that they can pick anyone up just on the basis of their skin color in the poorest districts in this country. So this conversation, in the absence of a real structural conversation of what's happening in society, really falls flat. That's why so many people are like, what the hell are you talking about? It's disconnected from the way we live and our reality. Tell this to Eddie Irizarry in Philadelphia. Eddie Irizarry in Philadelphia, a Puerto Rican kid who was just killed on August 14th. The cops said, oh yeah, he lunged at us. The kid was in a cop, the 27-year-old man, young man, the age of Mumia when he was imprisoned, was in his car, windows up, petrified, because he knew what was going to happen to him. You know, we can go on and on and on. The only thing in this society, in this country, that has pushed the power of the police back and its terror is when people rise up and say, we're not going to take the terror anymore. No, we're not going to take the terror anymore. So I think that the broader issues here are important, and we're living in a society that's increasingly polarized on the basis of class. And what is our response? Cop City. Cop City. So we need to start talking about abolition. The abolition of police and the replacement of police. We need more social workers. We need more teachers. We need more people to handle the traffic. We need more money in our communities because we know that crime, and it's petty crime, rises when people are in need, when people don't have jobs. The majority of people who are imprisoned don't have jobs at the moment of their imprisonment. I'll stop there.
So, Amanda,
because I arrived on the Amtrak this morning, and I came into Providence Station because what Sister Johanna just said, and Brother Mr. Brown, we talked about implicit bias and the limitation of those trainings. There needs to be undoing racism trainings mandated across the board to really, because implicit bias can be like over here, so we don't have to address racism. 3 officers who are right now at the Amtrak station literally profiled me. If I didn't have somebody in my ear as I sat down to drink my tea with my Mumia Abu Jamal sticker on my teacup and eating my breakfast sandwich, waiting to come here. As I get up, because I'm aware, as a revolutionary who has to move through and travel all the time, I also have a disability where my glasses are dark. So they're assuming, because of whether racism or implicit bias, who is this person of color? She's in dark glasses. 3 officers this morning sat there in that station. As I moved to go to the restroom, and then I moved to go into the store to get some candies, they literally stood at the door of the entrance of the little store in that place, right? And I'm literally making sure I'm talking loud so they know I have somebody in my ear, right? And making it be known that I'm on my way to Brown University, right? So you have to validate your humanity. So I want to not just talk about police departments, but all layers of the FOP apparatus, whether they be transportation police, they be the police that are in the schools, except security guards. We have to put them all together and understand the only way we're going to get justice is what Johanna just said. We have to abolish the system, and I hope that you all go to that exhibit, because I heard you also say, Ms. Martha, about the community voices, right? But however, when one cop gets killed, that's all they need is that one voice. But when they're murdering our people, they tell us you got to have the community, you got to have the masses to come and get change. We say change should come from anybody. One of our people drop, we have all right to come in the name of that person. Because Tyree Nichols in Tennessee, you have the Scorpion unit. How are you going to train them brothers? Because those were all brothers. So we understand once you put on that uniform, where you might say the uniform is just a uniform, it holds no power. But they understand that it holds power when they put it on, whether they're black, brown, or whatever color they are. Because we saw that with George Floyd. It was almost every different race that stood by and watched a man's life be taken. But I just wanted to put that out there because right now in Providence, Rhode Island, at that station, you got 3 coppers that literally stood there for 30 minutes. I was in that station, and they were just concentrated on me. And if I didn't know how to move carefully, because the elders have taught me as you travel how to move, from Massage Shakur's teaching all the way to our move family, everybody, right? It's dangerous when you're a black woman out here, or a black man, or a brown person, or even a poor white person, and you're trying to navigate, and then you violated my rights under the ADA, but if they don't see us as humans, how are they gonna tell us, how are they gonna respect our rights? So that's the thing too, I agree with everything that Johanna said, our beloved right here said, and this brother right here said. Thank y'all.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for this incredible discussion. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank the audience for your engaged and important comments. And I'll add, because I got the mic and the podium, one final thing that I was thinking, because we were talking about systems, and we're talking about legacy, and we're talking about future, and we're peeling apart all of these pieces. I think a lot about the role of media in creating different mythologies, and creating mythologies around police departments. And I'll share one quick thing, because we really need a break, so we got a great panel coming up next. As somebody who is a survivor of early childhood abuse, one of the things that I thought a lot about was how I used true crime as a way to confront my own trauma. And then, as I became more educated and began to learn about what's happening in carceral systems, I really had to confront my own self around that and confront that. You know, it's something that you get exposed to at an early age. And so I think even apart from this, we live in this ethos of media, and we live in this ethos where there is a lot of talk about crime and punishment, law and order, huge grossing series that it is almost like a way of erasing all of the complexities. So I want to hold this audience, and I want to deeply thank you for these comments. I want to give another round of applause for our panelists for the work that you are doing. We are going to take a 10-minute, not a 15-minute break, because we're going to come back and talk about a crucial issue, which is the role of medical care in the carceral system, which is very directly related to the papers of Mumia Abu-Jamal and the exhibit we have over at the library. Thank you, everybody.